Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Harmony Insights lunch date. My name is Erich Kurschat. I am the owner of Harmony Insights LLC, a company that allows me to work with organizations and consultants using the DISC personality assessment. And a lot of companies, actually, I just did a workshop this week, are bringing people together online to complete the assessment online and then to facilitate really meaningful conversation and dialogue about how we connect with each other and our respective audiences at work, all using DISC. You can find out more about all of that at harmonyinsights.com. I'm also the founder of the HR Hot Seat Inclusive Mastermind community of, as we say, real HR pros solving real HR problems. We have at this point, I think, at least 2,600 members in about 10 different licensed chapters around the country. And we're coming together online these days, all virtual and all free. It's always been free to tackle common challenges. And our guest today has played actually a significant role in the history of HR Hot Seat. Our guest is Carlos Butler-Vale. And so, Carlos, let me just initially welcome you to today's Harmony Insights lunch date.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to also see some familiar faces too. So,
Carlos, it is just a pleasure to have you on. I know I've kind of given you the runaround in terms of making a date available, but the fact that you grabbed one is something that I'm pleased about. I'll tell people we initially met because you attended a DISC workshop that I did.
I did. Yeah, that's
Through
right.
Chicago SHRM, a local SHRM chapter that we were both active with. And then you connected me with your employer at the time, Groupon, to host an HR Hot Seat Chicago event. And you and I have stayed in touch ever since. So I'm so
Yeah.
glad that we've been connected like this.
Eric, I have to tell you that that disc workshop honestly has been something that I have leveraged, not to plug, anything in, and this is not a paid endorsement, but I think it's been something that I've leveraged so many times in my professional career since doing it. And so I encourage everyone to highly, if you haven't done something like that, you should. You're right, it was a great session, and I'm glad that we've stayed connected since.
Oh, I love it. Thank you for saying that. So
Yeah.
people know that I choose my guests, my lunch date guests, and my guests choose our topics, and they bring something that they're passionate about. And so you have titled our conversation today, "What Recent Shifts in Diversity and Inclusion Work Mean for HR Professionals." And let me just say right off the bat that we certainly have HR professionals that have joined us, but we'll have folks in job transition, leaders at different levels of the company, just kind of a diverse array of folks, which is how I'd like for things to be. In your work as the director, this is quite a title, by the way, the Director of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement for McDonald's. What
Yeah.
is it about this particular topic that you were so passionate about that you wanted to bring it to our audience today?
Yeah, I think when I think about just, people functions, so regardless of what part of, of a people function it is that you're a part of, the reality is that the last 2, 3 months have caused a significant change and shift, I think in the way that we think about these things, the way that we approach, how we go about this, has really surfaced a need for people to want to make sure that they feel heard, that they trust, their leadership. And so I think the reality too is that as a D&I professional, there's only so much influence that I have. D&I, and by the way, D&I isn't just the work of D&I leaders. I'm sure almost all of you probably can agree and and attest to that. And so I really think, more broadly, anyone that's part of a people function is a key player in being able to move through this work and helping figure out how we have these conversations. And so that was sort of the initial thought for me.
I love that. You've touched on enough things that could keep us busy for the next 23 minutes.
Yeah.
Made some great points, and we're going to certainly touch on those. So the first thing I want to grab out of what you just said is that the work of a D&I professional specifically, and I know your background, I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile here on the left, that you were in inclusion and diversity for Groupon, global
Hmm.
program manager, and you have in there that Groupon was 6,500 employees at the time in 15 countries.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then you ended up with McDonald's and have been there for a little over a year. I'm
Hmm.
assuming a wider reach than Groupon in a number of different
Yeah.
ways.
We're in
A larger
125
footprint.
countries, and we have 125 countries and 2.2 million employees.
Holy cow. So
Yeah.
in this global role, let me start out by asking you, even though you've already said that D&I is not the work of a specific person,
Yeah.
what is the value? What is the importance? Maybe there are even pros and cons of having a committed internal D&I practitioner.
Yeah, I think the reality is that I've come across, and maybe I've just been very fortunate, but I've come across a lot of leaders who are really interested and really committed to figuring out how to drive this work forward, and oftentimes just don't know the best way to even start or how to actually continue to move that work forward. And I think that that's where having a committed internal D&I function, or a group of folks that are a part of this, I think is really important, because just like I might have a fairly decent understanding of operations, for example, that doesn't mean that I would be ready and willing and equipped to just go ahead and lead an operations function. And so I think and especially because D&I DEI has continued to sort of shift and change. I think that really having subject matter experts in that are always keeping a finger on the pulse and understand some of the trends, and understand, I'll give you a great example. When COVID-19 really hit, we were looking at COVID-19 as an organization in terms of the overall impact on our employees. But then the D&I function stepped in and said, hey, we also need to make sure that we're looking at this from the perspective of how it's affecting certain populations, specifically the Black and brown communities here in the US, and even some diverse populations abroad. Uh, you know Oftentimes it's not that people don't have that like desire to support something like that, or desire to even look at it from that perspective, but because it's not their area of work, it just doesn't necessarily happen. And we can't assume that culture is always going to necessarily be enough to ensure that we look at it from that lens.
Is a challenge then, because I promise our attendees that we touch on challenges that they may be facing, and certainly invite them to chime in with their challenges, and also leave them with some tips and resources. Could the flip side of that then also be that it falls squarely on that person's shoulders, and people say, oh yeah, we have a D&I person who's taking care of that. Like, it isn't necessarily in my job description as even a leader or a contributor, certainly in the company. We got someone who takes
Yeah.
care of that. Have you seen that before?
I've seen that before, and that to me raises red flags. So I think if I'm just being and you'll always get transparency from me. So
That's why you're
so
here, my
so that
friend.
exactly, yeah. That to me raises red flags, because I think that it's just like saying that culture is only one person's responsibility. It's just like saying it's so ultimately, should there be someone who might potentially be responsible for ensuring that we're embedding this into our systems, that we're embedding this into our processes, that we're looking at it from different perspectives? Yeah, absolutely. But the reality is, especially because most D&I teams comparatively are relatively small, there's no way possible that one person or even just two people potentially might be able to really to do that. So the challenge for most D&I professionals is to work with function leaders, work with business leaders, to ensure that we're embedding this into the culture as much as possible, and really helping folks understand that we all play a role in this. So again, if you're in one of those organizations, not to give you career advice, but if you are in one of those organizations where you feel that there's typically this sort of like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to give it to the D&I person because that's their job. I think that it might be time for some additional conversations there.
Yeah, or look elsewhere, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly.
Who knows? I want to launch a quick poll that I put together, if people are able to see this. Does your organization have a dedicated DEI? So we throw around a lot of acronyms, and I'm gonna transition to this. This is actually a great segue. Diversity, equity, and inclusion in this case. Does your organization have a dedicated DEI position? So as people chime in there, I want to compliment you, Carlos. Actually, one of our attendees wanted to compliment you, Pamela. Congratulates you and McDonald's on being one of the top 100 under 50 emerging leaders. Actually,
Well,
that
thank
must be
you.
you then. The emerging
Yeah,
leader
that's
must be
me.
you.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. I appreciate that. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Where was that? Where was that
It
published?
was through Diversity MBA, and they have a list of top 100 under 50 emerging leaders and executives. And I just got the wonderful news, I think, last week, and it's a great organization, so I'm happy to have been recognized by them.
Good. That means they accepted my nomination, so I'm glad to hear it. I'm joking, although I would nominate you. So here's the deal. I'm going to end the poll here. I think everybody who's going to contribute has contributed. And let's see how this shakes out. 22% say yes, they have a dedicated DEI person. 50% say no. That could have to do with kind of size of company, perhaps. And then 28% say it doesn't apply. Maybe they're in job transition, not currently employed. Does anything surprise you here? I mean, it seems perfectly reasonable that some people might not have a dedicated role, especially if they're on the smaller side. Is that a fair correlation?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I think in the last 3 months, I've seen a shift in even having some of these smaller organizations either have or start to create a dedicated DEI position, or at least work with external consultants in this space to be able to figure out how to move this and bring it into the culture. I think the 50% was probably a little bit more of a surprise. I didn't realize that it would be maybe that high.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe more like probably no more than 35%, but I do think we'll probably continue to see maybe a trend or a shift in having, and what I've noticed, Eric, is that typically it's a combined, right? So like I'm doing both DEI and something else. So I'm not just, diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least is what I've seen on some of these smaller
Yeah.
organizations. And for those of you that don't, I mean, I think it's a great opportunity now, especially to maybe, have some conversations with your leadership to talk through that. In most of the circumstances or situations where I've seen, especially in smaller organizations where they have dedicated something like that, it was very grassroots, from within, folks saying, hey, we absolutely need this. And then they find somebody who has a passion for it, and typically they end up sort of taking that on.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm looking over here in the comments section, and I always expect to see some familiar faces from around the Chicago area, which is where I am. And I'm glad to see people tuning in from Columbus, Ohio, the Twin Cities.
I saw
And as far we
Barbados.
have Barbados is in
Yeah.
there. We may even have someone from Scotland or Ireland, if I remember correctly. So I love that. I love
Me
seeing
too.
that. I mean, obviously, this is a topic that is relevant wherever you happen to be, and that's one of the great things I think about your
Absolutely.
role with McDonald's is you're seeing this conversation playing out, and you're driving it probably to some extent across the world, right?
I am actually. So in the middle of June, I was actually given the responsibility of leading our entire company's global DEI strategy refresh, and that has been awesome. It has been such an undertaking too. I mean, again, you think about all the different markets, the different operating models that we have around the globe, but we made a conscious decision as a company to have one global aspiration and three global pillars that were going to lead this work. And so I'm constantly having conversations, even with folks from Helsinki, Finland, around how, around what diversity, equity, and inclusion is to them, and how we can continue to help move that work forward.
Yeah. So, it strikes me when we have conversations about this, or honestly, so many things, that the language we use becomes so important, right? To have this common language that really unites us around this, and I'm thinking of the disc work that I do, but this common language that unites us around meaningful conversation, which is
Mm-hmm.
something that people know I'm very passionate about. So for the longest time, and I've asked this of other guests too, for the longest time, I heard diversity and inclusion, and sometimes they're inverted, inclusion, diversity. Then
Mm-hmm.
equity was part of that acronym, diversity, equity, and inclusion, something that I think I see most often these days. And then Brene Brown, among others, has really been intentional about adding belonging. Some of
Mm-hmm.
my other guests have said, well, I see belonging as part of either the diversity, equity, or inclusion piece already. And
Yeah.
then Brene Brown has been very vocal about saying that's a fourth pillar, like that's a fourth piece of this puzzle. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what, your own title aside, I suppose, which one of those words or combination thereof resonates most with you personally?
So we made a purposeful decision to actually, before our strategy was diversity and inclusion, it was actually gender balance and diversity strategy, but it was overall, couched under this diversity and inclusion strategy. For this strategy refresh, we actually added equity into the mix. And one of our pillars is to accelerate cultures of inclusion and belonging. So we're not missing that belonging component of it. But I do agree, I think it is really important. And I think that there's actually some really great ways to even measure or track what belonging sort of is. I do think belonging also shifts, obviously depending on what's happening. But I think for us, the equity part was really important because what we needed to do, and we've been undergoing this sort of re-education, or even for some of our markets around the globe, they don't really have very familiarity or any familiarity at all with this concept of equity, right? And in most cases, a lot of, especially European countries, are built around this concept of equality. And so we're giving everybody the same. And so what we've had to do is to really help educate folks around the difference between equity and equality, and how that is actually going to help really unlock, or equity, at least for us, is going to help to actually really unlock a lot of the things that we're wanting to do. I always give an example. $1,000, or even let's say $100, is not going to be, it's not going to be the same. If I gave you all $100, some of you might say, oh my gosh, I can feed myself now. Some of you might say, you know what, I don't need this $100. I'm perfectly fine. And so, what we realized though is that we just haven't really made enough gains when we've done, things to be equal. And we really now have to make sure that we're meeting people where they are. I think that adding a belonging really is, I've heard of justice too also being something
Oh,
similarly
right.
that folks are starting to add. I think some of that speaks to your culture, your company culture, and I think, for some organizations, it might be important to call those out specifically, because depending on where they are in their journey, they might need to really focus on belonging. I'm personally in that school of thought that I think belonging should absolutely be a part of that inclusion, um, that inclusion calculation. But I do think it needs to be called out separately in some way, shape, or form.
I I had a fantastic thought that just I had a contribution that was going to be so solid, and then
Was
suddenly
it
it is
around
no longer there.
justice?
Yeah, which
I
is
don't know.
fine. No, you know what?
Yeah.
Let's go to this. So, the title, what recent shifts in diversity and inclusion work mean for HR professionals. So I think we've done a really
Yeah.
good job setting the stage about what this can look like, how organizations may or may not be structured in terms of the resources that they've devoted to this conversation. But let's home in, I guess, on that recent shifts piece. So
Mm-hmm.
we're not talking generally about D&I work as it goes back several decades. We're talking about, I mean, potentially the last several months.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing in terms of these very specific shifts that are taking place in the workplace that HR pros may be involved with, that may have impacted their
Yeah.
work, but maybe more generally impact the work of people who want to contribute in some significant way?
And that's such a, I love the way that you just framed that question. So thank you. You know, you're right. I mean, I feel like we're sort of at this point now where we have kind of D&I sort of pre probably 2020, and just 2020, as we all know, has been a very interesting year. And I think that there probably is maybe even a separation sort of even beyond or before 2020. But I think especially, I mean, this time has been marked obviously by a lot of riots and protests, and calls for from just not just society, but even our own employees around, like, what is our stance, or what's our company's stance on Black Lives Matter? What is our company's stance on equitable treatment? What is our company's stance on, and so, and in many ways, I think we saw that probably a few years back happen corporate social responsibility. I think we're
Right.
starting to sort of see a very sort of similar push and focus on D&I, and I think some companies have reacted by obviously beefing up their D&I, functions, or creating a new D&I professional. Which, if you're a new D&I professional into an organization that hasn't had a D&I focus, can be a very, very significant, arduous task already in and of itself. And then you think about having to deal with all of the baggage and all of the emotional, components that I think people are that are top of mind. To me, that's shifted and changed. The other thing that I think has been really interesting is that. For a long time, I can say this, I think, just from my own, professional experience, it felt like even something like a Black Lives Matter movement was really something that was only pertinent or relatable to the US. And doing this work globally, I've realized that actually, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that there were Black Lives Matter protests around the world.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a call to, support what was happening in the US, but it was also around really giving light and visibility to some of the struggles that either ethnic, religious, any type of minority group is feeling in other parts of the world. That D&I work is already difficult, but I think all of those things, and HR work, by the way, of course, I know is very difficult. My background has been in HR for a long time. Um, but this requires us to really approach this very differently. It's about having ongoing conversations rather than just having sort of one-offs. I think the risks and the opportunities are heightened when it comes to how we approach this work. And I think that has absolutely, for anyone that's been a part of a people function, or obviously, if you have employees, within your organization, you realize that the way that things are now are completely different than they were in the beginning of the year, not just because of COVID. COVID, I think, has absolutely up the ante there, or made it, I think, a little bit more difficult. But then you couple that with everything that's happening socially, and I think that's been quite a shift for anybody.
I've heard colleagues talk about that in one fell swoop, they feel like their companies are having to articulate what they value and then demonstrate it all at the same time. And usually those are very separate processes. And there's all this time that goes into how do we, what do we value? How do we articulate that? How do we get that into our materials, social media posts, marketing, et cetera? And then how do we follow up with this demonstration piece? And a lot of
Yeah.
folks for a while were like, okay, I feel like our companies have nailed the articulation piece. We put out, what we believe our values and all of that on social media. We're really proud of it. We stand behind it. We believe wholeheartedly in it. But I'm not sure that follow-up is there yet. I'm not seeing it being demonstrated by my company. And I start to wonder then, have we just jumped on a bandwagon? Like, were we doing this for show? Do we work for a company who really believes this and lives these values in any sort of
Yeah.
meaningful way?
Yeah.
And my guess is we're still kind of squarely in the middle of that process, that journey, right?
You're 100% right. I mean, the reality is that I feel like we're still building the plane while flying it. And that is already actually a very difficult task in and of itself, right? I mean, if you're looking at just even a process change, that's not an easy thing to do. Then you bring in the people side of it and all of those emotions and those feelings and that level of accountability. I think, and that need to see continuous improvement and change, that makes it even more difficult. And that's why I'm saying anybody who's been a part of the people function, if you haven't felt it yet, I think you'll probably, you should brace yourselves, because and I don't say that in a bad way. I say that, this then gives you a really good opportunity to get ahead of it. But yeah, it's a lot. I mean, and I think especially because we were going through COVID, and I think in many cases, a lot of companies reacted so quickly and so swiftly to how we were going to actually navigate COVID, that like, when you juxtapose that to sort of what's happening around sort of, social justice and, some of these other things that are cultural shifts that in many situations have taken years, there's a, there's a fatigue there that I think we need to be aware of. And then there's also this level of impatience that I think we also have to be prepared for.
Yeah.
And some of that boils down to communication and really showing people, but you don't build trust overnight.
Yeah.
And I think that that's, again, part of the challenge.
This has been a fantastic conversation. We're already coming up on the end. I would love to leave people with one actionable tip. And by the way, Carlos, I'm going to invite you to send me any links, resources that you would like sent out to attendees today. And then I will send them an
Yeah.
email. Anybody who's attended, I'll include your resources and suggested links in an email. Can you leave people with one concise tip? We had a question that came through that asks, so how do we even begin to sell this to company leadership, sell D&I? And I'm paraphrasing, of course, as not
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
another HR thing, as something important. Do you have sort of a succinct tip to share with people?
Yeah, in my experience, I mean, you obviously have to approach it differently depending on the leader, but Eric, I think some of the disc work, to me, like that's kind of where I really started to frame things between the head and the heart. And I think that, I think that all leaders would, whether or not they think that this is the right thing to do morally, ethically, I think that you also sometimes have to show and demonstrate the impact on the business, and on the people when it comes to how when it comes to D&I and what it can do. So when I'm talking to a leader that I know that is very head versus heart, I talk about how their team could potentially perform 35% better, or that they're 75% more likely to capture a new market, or the fact that 87% of new job seekers are actively looking to actually join a diverse organization and diverse teams. And that already starts to shift the narrative a little bit and really starts to help us focus and understand, especially for a for-profit institution, how we can start to leverage D&I as a strategic growth driver. And I think so that's one part of it. And typically I haven't found that you have to have a lot of convincing around folks who believe that it's the right thing to do. I think for those, the conversation is a little different, and it really usually comes down to resourcing. So how are we going to help you make sure that you help us get this work through? But how can we better equip you to be an inclusive leader? How can we better, allow you to be able to, how can we better position you to be an ambassador for this work?
I love that. So actionable. That's what we promise, actionable takeaways. And you hit the nail right on the head. Carlos, people are going to want to follow up with you afterwards. Actually, people are already
Yeah.
chiming in that they want to pick your brain about D&I work that they're doing within their organizations. Where can people connect with you online?
Yeah, so they can absolutely connect with me on LinkedIn, or I can certainly go ahead and follow up with my email address again, with the strategy work, it's been a little crazy,
Yeah.
because this
Yeah.
has taken up 15 hours plus of my day. And I think right now there's obviously it's the most important and critical thing, I think, for our business, in addition to some of the values work that we've been doing. But I'm always happy to engage in quick conversations, and see how I can help.
We'll include your LinkedIn profile in our follow-up
Yeah.
email. I want to thank people for joining us today for just such a worthwhile, important, vitally important conversation. And Carlos, just having you with us and having you share the inspiration and the actionable tips you have, you've done McDonald's proud. I'm just going to say it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And listen, everybody, keep your heads up. I mean, I think that, the reality is that this is a time unlike I've seen before, working in this space, and I was joking with a few of my colleagues, but kind of not joking, that I feel like we're doing 10 years worth of DEI work. In the last 3 months, we've done 10 years worth of DEI work. And it's not stopping. It's not going anywhere. And so it's really around, and especially for us, we like to plan and we like to try to figure out how we can get ahead of things. But again, when you're building the plane while flying it, sometimes you don't necessarily have the ability to do that. But I think that this opens up some doors to potentially have some conversations, especially for those 50% of you that said that you don't have, DEI specific, positions, to have a conversation around how, this work can be, more impactfully sort of move through, because I think now's the time.
Thank you so much. If you were all as inspired by this conversation as I was, I hope you'll come back for future Harmony Insights lunch dates. You can find it all at harmonyinsights.com/lunch dates. And if you would share that URL with the hashtag lunch date, it helps people find out about what we do. Coming up on Tuesday, September 1st, which I believe is next week, Shouting into the Wind, Finding Your Voice in a World of Noise with Wendy Daly of the HR Social Hour half-hour podcast. On Thursday, September 3rd, a similar topic, Finding the Courage to Stand Out in a World That Wants You to Fit In with Lotus Buckner of LB Talent Solutions. She's a career coach, among other things. And so those of you in job transition will get a lot out of that. And then Thursday, September 10th, How to Create a Growth Mindset with Brendan Nichols of HRA of Greater Oak Brook. If you don't yet know who Terry Bean or Karen Allen are, September 24th, The Network is Everything will feature Terry Bean. And then October 6th, Developing Your Mental Strength with Karen Allen, who's a TEDx speaker. They're both going to be fantastic. Those are two names you need to know about. Right up there with Carlos Butler-Vale, I'll add. Carlos, it's been a fantastic conversation. I know
Thank
you
you
need
so
to
much.
get to another meeting, so we
Yeah,
won't
no worries.
prolong your stay here.
Listen, I have to maybe talk to some of these folks to figure out how I can come up with a more creative title for my next, lunch date.
It,
Because I mean, there's some really great stuff out there. So Marianne, I'm looking at you. Marianne's it's very creative about this stuff. So
hey, it worked. We got an audience, and plenty more will see
awesome.
this when I make the video available as well.
Thank
So
you so much. And everyone, congratulations for just even taking the time to hop on and to be a part of this.